There is a particular kind of person who has spent years rehearsing justifications for decisions no one actually asked them to defend, who has explained a choice 3 different ways, hoping the 4th version will finally land. This person rarely suspects that the explaining itself is the problem, not because they lack clarity, often the opposite. They usually have excellent reasons for what they do. They simply have not yet noticed that reasons were never actually what was being requested. Over-explaining does not look like weakness from the outside. It looks like thoroughness, like respect, like the simple decency of making sure everyone understands where you're coming from before they judge you unfairly. It looks like communication, dressed up so convincingly that you mistake your own anxiety for diligence. And the truly unsettling part is this: the people who most reliably require an explanation from you are very often the same people who will find something wrong with it, no matter how complete it is. That pattern is not an accident. It is the entire mechanism. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called the persona, the mask a person builds to be acceptable within a group. And what he understood is that explaining yourself is very often the persona's primary maintenance work, the constant patching of a mask that fears it might slip. Some people explain because they were taught curiosity is love. Others explain because somewhere early on, explaining was the only thing that occasionally prevented punishment. There is a specific fatigue that arrives when you notice you have narrated your own life in real time to people who were never actually confused, only ever waiting for an opening. That fatigue is not paranoia, it is data. This is where most people's understanding of over-explaining fails them. They imagine it as simply a communication style, something to be corrected with better wording or more confidence. But the over-explaining that actually drains a life, the kind that quietly consumes decades without ever being named, is not a communication problem. It is a permission problem. It is the belief, installed long before you had any say in it, that your choices only become valid once someone else has approved the reasoning behind them. You don't notice this belief because it doesn't feel like a belief. It feels like manners. What you are actually carrying is an old contract that says your autonomy requires a co-signature, and you have been quietly hunting for that co-signature in every room you enter ever since. Someone who was raised to anticipate criticism does not need an actual critic present to start defending themselves. They only need a pause, a raised eyebrow, a slightly flat tone, and the explaining begins automatically, because the explaining was never really about this decision. It was about every decision before it that once required defending to stay safe. And here is the part that is difficult to sit with. The people who over-explain the most are rarely indecisive. They are often the most capable people in a room, the ones who have thought through their choices more carefully than anyone questioning them ever will. Their thoroughness, which in any healthy context would simply be competence, becomes in this context a self-imposed courtroom, one where they are permanently the defendant and everyone else is permanently the jury, regardless of whether anyone actually asked them to stand trial. Not because thoroughness is naive, but because thoroughness, offered before it is ever requested, quietly teaches the people around you that your decisions are always up for debate, simply because you keep opening the floor to it yourself. Jung wrote about the shadow as the disowned part of the self, a person refuses to examine directly, and one of the shadow's quieter disguises is a constant, low-grade fear of being seen as selfish, difficult, or wrong. Explaining yourself excessively is often the shadow's chosen strategy for staying hidden. If you can just make the reasoning airtight enough, the fear reasons, no one will ever get close enough to see the parts of yourself you have never fully accepted. But the explaining does not protect those parts. It simply exhausts you in their defense, forever, without ever actually resolving what you were afraid someone might find. You didn't build that fear alone, but you are the one still standing guard over it, every single day, with reasons instead of rest. There is a moment early in most lives where this pattern gets installed. It usually looks like a child offering a reason for something before being asked, learning quickly that an unexplained action invited scrutiny, while an explained one, sometimes, was allowed to pass. That child was not wrong to adapt. What actually happened is quieter and more permanent than it felt at the time. You learned that your right to act came with homework attached, a lesson you have been completing, unprompted, for every decision since, long after the original grader left the room. This is the part almost no one wants to accept. Being asked to explain yourself as a child is not the same as needing to explain yourself as an adult. It can be the exact same behavior, carried forward decades past its expiration date, mistaken the entire time for basic courtesy. The unconscious mechanics of over-explaining rarely begin with an actual demand. They begin with anticipation, a felt sense that someone might have a problem with what you're doing, and that the problem can be headed off if you arrive first with all your reasons laid out. This anticipatory explaining feels, in the moment, like control, like handling a situation before it becomes one. And the human mind, wired to reduce uncertainty wherever it can, rewards that anticipatory explaining with a small hit of relief every time it seems to work, which trains you to keep doing it, whether or not it was ever actually necessary. This is not a flaw in your character. It is a feature of how threat detection has functioned for the entire span of human history. Preparing a defense before conflict arrives once kept people safer in unpredictable social hierarchies. It simply was not designed for an adult life where most of the people you explain yourself to were never actually going to challenge you at all. Once this pattern is running, the second phase begins, and it is almost always invisible while it's happening. It is the phase where you start pre-explaining decisions to people who never asked, apologizing in advance for boundaries before anyone has reacted to them. This has a name in psychological language, anticipatory appeasement, but the term rarely captures how much it feels, from the inside, like simple thoughtfulness rather than a fear response running on autopilot. What it actually describes is the slow replacement of your own authority over your choices with an imagined tribunal that follows you into every room. One built from every person who ever made disapproval expensive for you to survive. You begin to doubt not the decision itself, but your right to make it without first proving it was reasonable. That is the actual cost, not the specific explanations you give, but the years spent treating your own judgment as something perpetually on trial. There is a particular category of relationship where this shows up most intensely. Certain people, whether through their own unresolved need for control or their own discomfort with anyone having autonomy they don't personally approve of, will respond to any unexplained decision with visible displeasure, a sigh, a pointed silence. This is rarely random. It is often a method of maintaining influence over you, because a person who explains themselves constantly is a person whose choices can still be negotiated, delayed, or quietly redirected. One explanation at a time. There is a specific quiet that develops in people who have explained themselves for a long time. It is the quiet of someone who has finally noticed that the explaining rarely changed anyone's reaction anyway, and has started, tentatively, to withhold it. You stop offering reasons before they're requested, not because you stopped respecting the people around you, but because offering them always seemed to invite exactly the scrutiny you were trying to prevent. That pattern is the entire mechanism keeping the old fear fed. People who benefit from your constant explaining rarely need to demand it outright. They only need to make the absence of an explanation feel costly enough, through disappointment, through a raised eyebrow, that you begin supplying explanations before they're ever asked for. Eventually, you ration your own certainty down to nothing, and the constant justifying that replaces it looks, from the outside, remarkably like good communication. There is a particular exhaustion in narrating your own life to an invisible jury. There is only a slow, cumulative depletion, and the unsettling sense that you have become a permanent witness for your own defense in a trial that was never formally opened. This happens through a mechanism Jung would have recognized instantly, though he framed it through projection rather than explanation directly. He observed that people frequently locate in others the judgment they have not yet resolved in themselves. The internal voice demanding you justify your every move is very often not the voice of anyone currently in your life. It is an old voice, projected onto every neutral face in every ordinary room, whether or not that face has ever actually judged you at all. Projection here is efficient, precisely because it borrows your own decency as its delivery mechanism. You already want to be fair. So, before anyone reacts, Some part of you begins supplying the reaction on their behalf, preemptively defending against a verdict that, in most rooms, was never actually being prepared. You become your own prosecutor and your own defense, arguing a case the room never filed. That is the mechanism, self-surveillance, extracted through your own fairness. Here is where the disturbing realization begins to surface, the one most people spend considerable energy avoiding. If this pattern depends so heavily on your own fairness, then no external villain is required to keep it running. This is not the same as blaming yourself for developing the habit. That distinction matters, but understanding requires looking honestly at the specific fear that keeps triggering the explaining, because that fear does not disappear once you learn the concept. It simply waits for the next silence to fill. For many people, the answer traces back to an environment where a decision made without adequate justification was met with real consequence. A parent whose disappointment was disproportionate, a household where being wrong carried a cost far larger than the actual mistake. Jung would have called this the shaping of the persona under duress, a mask built from whatever configuration of preemptive defense kept the peace. The people who now seem to require your explanations did not invent this reflex in you. They simply inherited a stage that was already set, long before they ever walked onto it. Recognizing this is not about becoming someone who withholds context out of principle or performs cold indifference. It's about becoming familiar enough with your own reflex to justify that you can tell the difference between genuine communication and a fear response wearing communication's clothing. You were not overly deferential by accident. You were adapted to an environment where explaining first sometimes prevented a worse outcome, where getting ahead of judgment felt, correctly at the time, like the only available form of safety. The tragedy is not that you developed this skill. The tragedy is that people who want influence over you can sense exactly which door your old fear left unlocked. There is a moment where you begin to notice the pattern itself rather than any single instance of it. Not this person needed an explanation from me, but I keep supplying one, in different rooms, to different faces, and I keep leaving each conversation having said more than the moment actually required. That moment feels like grief, because it means acknowledging that the exhaustion was never fully caused from outside. Some of it belonged to people who took advantage of your willingness to justify yourself, but some of it belonged to a much older agreement you made with yourself, usually as a child, that being acceptable required being explainable at all times. That agreement is still running in the background of your adult life. No one told you it expired. Jung believed the unconscious does not simply store the past. It repeats it insistently until it is finally witnessed and understood, rather than merely managed. This is why the pressure to explain yourself can feel eerily identical across completely unrelated relationships. A boss, a partner, a parent, a stranger online, all triggering the same old reflex as though they were the same person wearing different faces. The people who seem to require your explanations most are not, in most cases, deliberately controlling you. They are people who have simply learned that you will supply justification without being asked. It stopped working the moment you stopped supplying the reflex they had grown to expect. This is not a strategy you can perform as sudden coldness. What actually disrupts the pattern is something quieter, a genuine, settled trust in your own judgment, one that does not require anyone else's approval to feel complete before you act on it. People don't resent you for no longer explaining yourself. They resent losing access to the reassurance your explaining used to provide them, the reassurance that your choices were still, in some sense, subject to their input. There is something almost clarifying about seeing this clearly, even though clarity at first does not feel like relief. It feels like loss, the loss of the story where enough explanation would eventually earn you the right to simply be trusted. In its place is a more demanding story, one that asks you to examine what in your history made explaining feel like the price of belonging in the first place. Not so you can carry blame, but so you can finally stop paying a toll that was never actually required. The gate was never labeled disapproval. It was labeled belief that your right to act required someone else's signature. And once you notice exactly where that belief came from, something strange happens. You start to notice, almost immediately, When a room is asking for your reasoning simply out of habit, rather than any actual need to understand you, you do not become dismissive. You become fluent in a language you were speaking your entire life without ever knowing you were speaking it. There is a specific kind of quiet that follows this realization. It is closer to standing in a room you have lived in for years and suddenly noticing exactly how much of its furniture you built yourself, out of fear, out of habit, out of a belief that silence about your own reasoning was somehow a form of disrespect. You start reviewing old conversations with a different instrument, not memory exactly, something closer to forensic honesty. And what you find is rarely one dramatic confrontation that demanded your defense. It is dozens of small moments where no one actually asked anything, and you supplied a defense anyway, simply because the silence felt unbearable to leave unfilled. Jung wrote that the psyche seeks wholeness, not comfort, and that anything preventing wholeness will eventually surface as symptom rather than insight, if insight is refused for too long. This is often what the fatigue after ordinary conversations, the resentment that has no clear target, actually are. Not rudeness in you, correspondence. The unconscious sending you a report on a discrepancy the conscious mind has been too polite to examine. Recognizing this, in the end, was never really about deciding that everyone who ever asked you to explain yourself was a villain. Most of them were not. They were simply people operating in a world that rarely asks anyone to examine whether their curiosity about someone else's choices is actually their business at all, and you were simply the one generous enough and afraid enough to keep answering as though it always was. And now that this has been named clearly, it no longer fits quite the way it used to. Somewhere right now, someone exactly like you is making a decision quietly without rehearsing a single sentence to defend it, standing in front of someone exactly like the one who once required a full account of everything you did. They will learn, eventually, that most silences do not require filling. Or they won't, and they'll spend years the way you once did, mistaking justification for connection, narrating a life to an audience that was never actually watching as closely as the fear insisted they were. There is no guarantee that awareness arrives before the cost adds up. Sometimes it only arrives afterward, quietly, uninvited, forcing you to recognize exactly how much of your life you spent defending a decision no one ever formally challenged.